Welcome everyone to tonight's last FAFP COVID-19 webinar for 2020, the 13th this year. Once again, I'm Dr. Chris Scuderi, and this year I've had the pleasure of chairing the FAFP's COVID-19 Task Force, which continues to lead the FAFP's efforts to assist Florida's family physicians and their staff in dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. Tonight's presentation, COVID-19 Vaccine Development, Safety, and Expected Efficacy, will feature one of the country's foremost experts in vaccines and immunization policy, Dr. Jonathan Temte, who is the Associate Dean for Public Health and Community Engagement at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health, a professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health, and a family medicine physician at the Access Community Health Centers. Dr. Temte has served as a clinician, teacher, and researcher for 25 years. An expert in vaccines and immunization policy, he currently serves on the U.S. Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, ACIP, and is acting as chair of its evidence-based recommendation work group. Dr. Temte was the first family physician to chair ACIP from 2012 to 2015, and in 2018, he received the AAFP's Public Health Award for his career commitment to the enhancement of public health in the United States and beyond. So as you can tell, we have a very accomplished expert to lead tonight's webinar. Thank you for participating, Dr. Temte. Before we begin, remember that similar to all FAFP webinars, participants will be in listen-only mode, but you can type questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen that your presenter and I can see. We will attempt to answer your questions either during or at the end of this presentation. Okay, let's get started with tonight's presentation. Dr. Temte, welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for the introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight. Before we got started, we were just chatting, and 30 years ago, this very evening, I was on call as a first-year resident at St. Mary's Hospital, and overnight we had a 16-inch snowstorm. And I got to spend an extra 8 hours in the hospital until I could escape at that time. But it's wonderful talking to colleagues down in Florida. We're under a balmy 35-degree evening tonight. I suspect you're having a much better environment than we are at this point in time. But over the next few minutes, I'd like to try and take you through a little bit on the current scenario that we have with our COVID-19 vaccines, talk a little bit about development, safety, and our expected efficacy. And by way of just starting out here, I had a ACIP working group call this afternoon where we actually got to hear the data presentation directly from Pfizer vaccines. And I can honestly say I'm actually pretty much blown away by both the safety and efficacy of this vaccine. And I suspect we're going to see the same with some of the other vaccines as well. So I'm going to just make sure I can get to the slides here. And there we go. Objectives. I want to try and give some basic concepts of a pandemic vaccination program and how we go about protecting vulnerable individuals. Talk about the herd effects and talk about that interplay between vaccine coverage and vaccine effectiveness, which is going to be very, very important. I also want to just touch upon the potential problems that we have with our convergence of COVID-19 and influenza. Provide a quick forecast perhaps for influenza coming up. I'm going to review the steps in development and approval for a new vaccine, and then describe the current vaccines we have in advanced stages of testing. And now we have 2 that have been submitted for FDA emergency use authorization.
Dr. Temte, this is Jay Milson with the FAFP. Can you check your connection with your microphone? We're getting a lot of feedback and comments from attendees.
Okay. Is that any better?
Unfortunately, it is not.
Okay. How about now?
No, sir. I'm still hearing it. Yeah.
Okay.
That's it.
try and do is log
That's better
off
right
of the,
there. Yeah.
pardon?
That's better right there. That whatever you're doing, that sounds good. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll go like this. So apologies for the connectivity. I think I'm wearing out the port here on my computer. But one of my favorite graphics for COVID-19 is this Swiss cheese. And maybe that's because I'm from Wisconsin. But when we look at this particular virus and getting through the pandemic, we have to look at a lot of different scenarios and a lot of different interventions. Some are that personal responsibility, which involve the face masking, the social distancing, hand washing, staying home while sick, the testing and quarantining, and so on. And some are more the shared responsibilities, and that takes us through the response in our hospitals, and our clinics, and so on, and also takes us all the way to the vaccines. And no one intervention is going to end this. We have to use all these together. When we talk about a pandemic vaccination program, we really start looking at this balance between immunity and vulnerability. And when we start thinking about something called the herd effect, or the herd threshold, we're really looking at how many people do we have to have immune in a population to make something go away. And we also have to keep in mind that with a vaccine, in this type of situation, vaccinating one person oftentimes will protect more than that one person. The shape of the curve between the percent of population at risk and the percent of population that are immune and recovered is really based on how transmissible a virus is. So you've heard of the R0 or R sub-0, and that tells us basically the number of new cases that will be generated by each existing case. And for SARS-CoV-2, the virus behind COVID-19, we think we need an estimated population immunity somewhere between 55 and 70%. Recently, there was a nice article in JAMA that depicted a number of viruses and the herd immunity threshold. And I'd like to point out up on the upper right-hand corner, our good old friend measles, which is the most contagious respiratory virus out there. In each case leading to 14 or 15 new cases, you need a population immunity at about 94% to keep measles at bay. Well, for SARS-CoV, that we think tends to generate 2.5 new cases per case, we're right around 60%. So let me walk you through this a little bit. To get to 60% of this herd immunity or herd effect, we can kind of partition this between the natural immunity we get from becoming infected and recovering and having some immune protection, and adding to that the amount of vaccine-induced immunity. And in this particular situation, I'm hypothesizing about 10% community obtained immunity and 50%. Well, the way we get to that 50% vaccine induced is by multiplying the vaccine coverage and the vaccine effectiveness. So for example, if we have a vaccine that's 90% effective, we need at least 56% of us to get vaccinated. All right, so keep that in mind. This is a graphic for SARS-CoV-2 with the estimated vaccine effectiveness on the x-axis and the needed vaccine coverage on the y-axis. And the take-home point here is the more effective, the less people need to get it. But this is where the problem comes in. This is a survey from Ohio State University back in about August. And at that time, they said, oh, about 7 in 10 Americans will receive or be willing to receive the vaccine. You do the calculations and you come up with about 70% of people need to get that vaccine. Well, a little bit later, it was just 50% of Americans. This is from the Kaiser family, or this is from Science magazine. And with 50%, you need an absolutely perfect vaccine, 100% effective. And now with the current vaccines from Pfizer and from Moderna with about 90 to 95%, we're looking at needing to get in that mid 50s to 60% range. And that can be a tall order in this country where there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy, a lot of misinformation out there, particularly on social media. So file that away for a little bit here. I'm going to just mention very quickly that we're in the middle of a global pandemic, but that doesn't mean that other viruses can't circulate. And one of the big viruses out there is influenza. At least in my state, our Division of Public Health has put out strong messaging to make sure we're immunizing all of our patients, particularly whenever we see them in the context of having fewer primary care visits out there. But it's going to be very, very important to lower the number of possibilities when a patient comes in with a febrile respiratory illness. And influenza vaccine can help with that. Now, the good news is shown in this slide from a friend of mine in Australia, working with the World Health down in Melbourne. And Australia made it through this past summer for us, but their winter is basically June, July, and August. They made it through this without any influenza. They virtually had just a handful of cases across a country of 24 million people. And this is the case also in Chile, Argentina, South Africa, and New Zealand. These are all Southern Hemisphere countries that experience the same seasonality of influenza that we do. And because of things such as social distancing, masking, hand washing, school closure, all of which are effective for SARS-CoV-2, they're not only effective, but they're incredibly effective for influenza. And so fingers are crossed here that we get through this winter without the coincidental influenza, but we'll have to just wait and see. With that in mind, we're still suggesting making sure that everybody gets their influenza vaccine. I'm going to move now to just talking a little bit about developing vaccines. And keep in mind that historically, this is about a 15-year process from the time we have identification of candidate disease to a licensed product. The other thing I can tell you is that the likelihood of a new vaccine going from identification of the candidate disease and early work to a saleable vaccine can probably be measured at less than 10%. This is not an easy task to bring to bear. So after we identify candidate disease, there's the laboratory isolation of antigens. And with SARS-CoV-2, literally by mid-January this year, we had the entire genetic code of this virus. We had understanding of what part of that genetic code coded for the spike protein and how the spike protein was the likely antigen for this virus. Well, after this, we get into vaccine development. There is first animal testing for safety and response, then human testing for safety and response. And once we get to that point, then we can look at an application to the FDA. But let me talk a little bit more about the human testing for safety and response. You've all heard of the various phases of clinical trials, from preclinical to the FDA review. You may not have heard about the phase 4 component, which is what happens after a drug is approved or a vaccine and after licensure. And this is the ongoing scrutiny that vaccines are given primarily for safety, but also for effectiveness. But let's talk more about the phase 1, 2, and 3. So phase 3 are the clinical trials that are focused on safety. These tend to be 20 to 100 healthy volunteers, and they're not randomized. We're just looking at how well the vaccine candidate works in terms of how much do you give? Do you give 1 or 2 or 3 doses? What do the side effects look like? Are the side effects related to the size of the dose? And we also look at some of the serological markers such as antibody levels or neutralizing antibody. The phase 2 trials now involved many more, usually several hundreds of volunteers. And here we're looking at common short-term side effects and looking at how the size of the dose relates to the immune response. And once the dosing is figured out, the schedule is figured out from these early phase trials, then we get into the phase 3, which are the randomized control trials that are designed to assess efficacy and safety. These are typically hundreds to thousands of individuals. And for the 2 current vaccines that are now in FDA hands, one was powered with 30,000 participants and the other at 44,000. These are incredibly large trials. And especially to have these trials set up, recruiting, and ready to go with data in only about 4 to 5 months. We can talk a little bit more about that in a little bit here. So safety is really, really paramount to any vaccine. Vaccines are used and typically given to healthy people to keep them healthy. And there is a necessity for that vaccine to be incredibly, incredibly safe. And the usual vaccine situation has safety assessments starting after the very first individual who is in a phase 3 trial receives that first dose. And for the COVID-19 vaccines, the 2 out there right now have 2 doses, and these are 21 to 28 days apart. And the traditional window to assess safety is 42 days or 6 weeks. And the reason why is most immunologic side effects occur within that window. It's rare to have something triggered off immunologically beyond 42 days. Beyond that 42 days, there's safety that keeps on going. And for the current vaccines, they're looking out for a total of 2 years. The FDA has required that at very minimum, the companies have to show data for a minimal of 60 days after the last dose was received in 50% of the participants. That means that we're looking at least half of that group making it out 60 days, so even longer than that 42-day window. So even though we feel that these have been coming along very, very quickly, and some people say rushed, what's not being rushed is the safety assessment. One of the reasons why this is possible are these trials are being done in the middle of a pandemic when there are a lot of people being exposed and coming down. And that'll be coming down with the disease. And that'll be clear in this next slide here in terms of efficacy. If we look at, for example, the trials done for the high-dose influenza vaccine, those trials took over 3 years to do. One of the reasons is the first year they tried it, it was a dud year for influenza. They didn't have enough people to show any efficacy at all. This has not been a problem with SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. A lot of people, unfortunately, are getting sick in this country. So the Pfizer vaccine did their primary efficacy analysis after they hit 170 cases in the combined placebo and vaccine groups. And their current data shows 162 cases in the placebo group and 8 in the vaccine group. This is also a trial set up where there were twofold more vaccine recipients than placebo recipients. And when you do the math, you get an incredibly, I'm sorry, I misspoke there. The Pfizer trial was 44,000 and 50-50 there. But at the end of the day, this was a 94 or 95% effectiveness for this vaccine, which is incredible. My wildest dream is hoping for about 70%. And we actually saw all the data in the presentation today, and it was just incredible. And on top of that, these effects are seen also in patients over 65 years old. So there didn't seem to be any drop off in terms of age, no drop off across groups. For example, African-American, Latinx individuals, and so on. Really high effectiveness across the whole board. The Moderna vaccine has accumulated 196 cases, and their efficacy is estimated at 94%. And their efficacy against severe disease was 100%, 30 cases in the placebo group and 0 in the vaccine group. So in my mind, both of these vaccines are hitting home runs in terms of the efficacy. And after now seeing some of the data on the safety, I'm very, very comfortable with the Pfizer vaccine. I haven't seen it yet for Moderna, but that's going to be coming forth quite shortly. So again, FDA had a minimum estimated efficacy of 50% for these vaccines, and we're almost double that. Okay, so getting back to our schematic here, once it goes to the FDA, we have licensure or emergency use authorization. It then goes to the advisory committee on immunization practices for the recommendation. And typically, they will post a provisional recommendation. This will go for approval for the Secretary of DHHS and by the CDC director, and then is published in MMWR. And once it's published in MMWR, it is official policy. Well, all I'm going to say is you're thinking, my goodness, there's a lot of bureaucracy. This can take forever. And as it turns out, the ACIP met 2 days ago on the 1st, and the publication from their vote on who should be in the first tier was posted today. So things can be done actually very, very quickly in a pandemic. Now, what we don't know for sure is what happens with that emergency use authorization, but we think it's going to go through the usual channels there. The emergency use authorization is a set of codes that allows the FDA to facilitate availability and use of a vaccine during a public health emergency. But the standards of safety and efficacy still need to be met. And people ask, well, why does it take this group so long, 7 to 10 days to go through the filings? It's because they look at all the raw data and they reanalyze everything. So there is independence from the company. They want to make sure that what the company is providing in terms of safety and efficacy is actually what they're finding from the data as well. But this really shortens the time between development of a vaccine and deployment. The recommendation is in the hands, at least traditionally, of the ACIP. And the ACIP will review all the data on safety and efficacy and so on, and provide the recommendation for the US civilian population. They'll also provide the details on dosing and intervals and precautions and contraindications. And unlike most situations, the ACIP has already had its first vote on the COVID-19 vaccines simply to indicate who gets to stand first in line. With ACIP recommendations, just for quick review, ACIP uses information on burden of disease, safety of the vaccine, the efficacy, the cost effectiveness, and that's kind of off the table for this particular vaccine. It's being purchased federally, and we don't really worry so much about that in the midst of a pandemic. The feasibility is really important. And finally, the values and preferences of vaccinators and of vaccine recipients. All that goes into the ACIP recommendation. And at the end of the day, we get the utilization by stakeholders and also coverage by the Vaccine for Children program, if the vaccine's aimed at children, and Affordable Care Act coverage as well. You've heard of Operation Warp Speed, and in my mind, what this did is really did a jumpstart for the vaccine manufacturing. It took a lot of the financial risk away from the companies and shared it with the company, or shared it with the federal government, but it also allowed the ramping up of large-scale manufacturing of vaccines prior to approval. If you recall what happened with Shingrix, the shingles vaccine, we had a very strong ACIP recommendation for that vaccine. Everybody wanted it, and none of us had it in our practices. And we had to really sit there for several months before we could start vaccinating. We don't want that to happen here. So this is a public-private collaboration between the manufacturers, Defense Department, CDC, FDA, and the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. So at the end of the day, we hope we end up with a lot of vaccines a whole lot earlier than in the traditional way. So mention a couple of the vaccines here. So the Moderna vaccine is a messenger RNA, as is the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. They're at somewhat different dosages. These are essentially messenger RNA wrapped in a lipoprotein envelope and injected. These are to be injected into the muscle. And things to keep in mind for people in practice is these are in multi-dose vials. And once you start using one vial, you have to use up that entire vial within about 6 hours of being either diluted or the vial being punctured. So these do not have a long-term stability. One of the things you've heard about with the Pfizer vaccine is the requirement for extremely cold, even for Wisconsin, extremely cold temperatures to keep that vaccine for a good period of time. Once it's warmed up to refrigerator temperature, it's good for 24 hours. And the Moderna vaccine is at standard freezer temperature, and once it's warmed up to refrigerator temperature, it's good for about 7 days. So some of the things to keep in mind with the current mRNA vaccines are the challenges with the really cold freezers needed, and the doses and vials reconstitution and the potential for waste in low volume clinics. The solutions we're looking at are centralized sites with the very, very ultra cold freezers. For example, in my state of Wisconsin, our Department of Health Services has now identified and selected 8 sites across the state that have large capacity ultra cold freezers. And there's some work with the manufacturer to try and get data on storage at warmer temperatures. 2 other vaccines that are worthwhile hearing about is the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, which is a recombinant adenovirus vaccine, or a vectored vaccine. This uses a chimpanzee adenovirus. It's non-replicating, but it introduces the genetic material into cells, and you produce the spike protein from there. This has been used previously for Middle East respiratory syndrome and showed encouraging early clinical safety. This is a 2-dose vaccine, 28 days apart, and this started phase 3 trials in the US in late August. They were suspended because of some concerns about safety in the UK, and then they have been restarted. And you may have heard recently that some of the sites messed up with their protocol and provided a half dose initially, followed by a full dose instead of per protocol, the 2 full doses. Turns out that Per protocol, the interim analysis shows about 60% effectiveness, and doing the protocol violation bumped it up to about 90%. So one of the concerns with this vaccine is that that first dose may sensitize your body to the chimpanzee adenovirus vector. And when you see it again, your immune system responds to the carrier virus and you don't get as good of a response. Similarly, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a recombinant human adenovirus vector, very much the same as the AstraZeneca. And they have had previous vaccines that worked well against Ebola. The wonderful thing about this vaccine is it's a single dose, and it has a really nice shelf life in the refrigerator. And so this is in US phase 3 trials. On October 12th, the trial was put on hold because of an adverse reaction in a volunteer, actually in Brazil. And it turns out they were in the placebo group. So this is up and running again. So the commonalities out there, all the vaccines really center on the spike protein of the coronavirus. 3 of the vaccines have 2 doses. The 4th has 1 dose. But you have to, if you start with one vaccine manufacturer, you have to give that second dose with the exact same vaccine. You can't mix and match like we do sometimes with other vaccines. There has to be really close attention to logging every dose into registries. But what we're seeing now is high efficacy across the board. The differences are the mRNA versus virus vector, vastly different requirements for storage and handling, and 1 versus 2 doses. And what we worry about a little bit in my mind is what happens if I have 2 vaccines that are 90% effective and a 3rd vaccine that's 60% effective. Who gets what? And that can set up some uncomfortable situations, I think. Prioritization is going to be something we're all facing. With this vaccine, we're looking at limited supplies initially. And this is not only true in the United States, but it's across the globe. And there will be nations that are haves, and unfortunately many nations that are have-nots with this. So thinking in terms of not only equity within our society, but across the globe is going to be important here. We're going to continue to have a lot of morbidity and mortality. And we do know already that these effects are not equally distributed. In my state, one of the worst outbreaks initially were in meat packing plants around the Green Bay area. Hence, the name the Green Bay Packers comes from that industry. After that, we've seen horrendous outbreaks in long-term care facilities, and Wisconsin has just registered the 9,000th individual within the correctional system being infected. And so congregated living situations, there are disparities between race and ethnicity, and occupational, and we all know that there's an age effect. The ACIP is going to be taking the lead on the prioritization and is doing so through its COVID-19 vaccine work group. So I mentioned that there was a meeting 2 days ago, December 1st. The final notice was on the 27th. So this is all going very, very quickly. And as you can look at the agenda, they had a vote here for allocation of initial supplies of COVID vaccine phase 1A. And what happened is that on the 1st, so 2 days ago, ACIP voted to provide guidance to prioritize vaccine to healthcare personnel who have direct exposure to patients with COVID-19 or potential exposure to infectious waste and long-term care residents. So those are the first people going to be vaccinated. The phase 1B and phase 1C are speculative right now. We haven't gotten to that point in decision making. But so right now, concentrate on your long-term care residents, especially the skilled nursing home and the healthcare personnel. We're looking at a very likely phased rollout, with phase 1 merging into phase 1B, merging into phase 1C to phase 2, and so on. And ACIP will continue meeting to provide guidance for each of these as time rolls along. When we get to distribution, we talked about warp speed really amping up the manufacture of vaccines. But you have to keep in mind that it's not only vaccines that might be in short supply, but needles and syringes and alcohol prep pads and Band-Aids and all those other things we need. And so there is an effort to bring together distribution of vaccine, distribution of the vaccine kits, getting these all distributed to central hubs and states, sent to the locations that have the ultra cold freezers, and then getting it out to the hospitals, the clinical settings, pharmacies, long-term care, and so on. So it is just a huge amount of planning and a difficult operation. So I'm gonna just finish up with a couple of things here. Communication is key here. This is gonna be very important. We do not have any experience in humans with messenger RNA vaccines. So there's a lot of concern with individuals about this new technology. And there's all sorts of misinformation within social media about how this will enter and become part of your DNA, how this will apparently make you more prone to listen to Bill Gates and much more susceptible to 5G signals on your cell phone. But in reality, this is a technology that's been around for a long time. It's been used in animal models safely. The mRNA vaccines don't contain any live virus. They just carry a little bit of that genetic code. When that's injected into an individual, we look at that being taken up by muscle cells, but the mRNA never enters the nucleus of the cell. It lives there in your endoplasmic reticulum, and this does not last or persist in your cells for a long time. It's degraded pretty quickly, but during its short life, it cranks out a huge amount of this spike protein. Oh. I somehow, let me try that again. Is that still there? Okay. So communication is also key. For some reason, I clicked on something and I went to a totally different screen and I was lost. But it's going to be really important at this point in time to start talking to your patients about these vaccines. A lot of people have questions. There's a lot of concern about the rapidity of creation of the vaccines. And it's really good time to start having that conversation now, even if you have an individual who's not going to be first in line. In general, the vaccines will be going to people who are at higher risk, either because of occupation or because of underlying medical condition or because of age. But really, you want to start having these conversations. You as a family physician are the most trusted source of information on vaccines, and you play a critical role. One of the things out there is because ACIP has prioritized healthcare personnel as the highest level, and those who are in, the front line, i.e. primary care, are going to be prioritized toward the very, very top. But the very act of receiving this vaccine can go a long way. I'll just tell you really quickly about a conversation I had with one of my medical assistants, an African-American woman, and I was asking her if she was going to get this vaccine when it came out, and she said she wasn't sure. And that's not uncommon. We find that African-Americans in general have about a 20% reporting rate of saying that they would accept a vaccine. But my conversations went on. Well, I go, what happens if I get it first? It goes, well, if you're willing to get it, then I'll get it. And I think we have to model our behavior with our patients, with our colleagues, with our medical assistants, with our nursing staff, with our front office staff, and everybody else. And then you want to be prepared to answer patients' questions. And I just have a link to a CDC talking to patient guide for COVID-19. And if you just Google CDC talking to patients, COVID-19 vaccine, you'll get there. So what we need for success here are the following. We need safe vaccines. And everything I've seen right now has blown me away in terms of the safety. We don't see any significant serious adverse effects. We do see some reactogenicity, which tends to be worse on day number 2, but it's short-lived. We need effective vaccines. And again, from what I've seen, these are incredibly effective vaccines. We need a reasonable stepwise allocation plan, and that's what we're counting on from ACIP to do. The distribution system is difficult, but this is part of that Operation Warp Speed. This is part of the federal system. It's part of your state systems to get that distribution down. We have to have that willingness to be vaccinated, and then we have to communicate. And, I'm sorry for, proselytizing Bucky Badger, but this is where I'm from. And if we can ever get our team away from COVID-19, we might actually be able to play a game again. So I'm going to stop there, be very open to any questions, comments you have, but thank you so much for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Temte. This was fantastic. Very timely, very comprehensive. We really appreciate your expertise tonight. Just thank you for spending this evening with us. We have a few questions from the audience that I'd like to share with you. The first is, if all vaccines were available and you had to choose one for you to receive, which one would you choose?
Well, I think the simple answer is the first one I can get. And that's likely for those of us in either in this forum tonight, it's either going to be the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine. I think that's going to be the first 2 vaccines out there, and they're going to be ramping up. And by the end of the day, I think there will be enough of those vaccines to cover our healthcare personnel and our long-term care residents. But so the first thing is, whatever vaccine comes my way first. But if it's Moderna or the Pfizer, they are both looking really good right now. And I wouldn't have any issue or quibble with either one of those. And I think as we get more information about the other vaccines, we're going to see that they're equally safe and probably pretty close to the same efficacy.
Excellent. Thank you. The next question we have had a couple on this, is if someone has already had COVID-19 and they've recovered with demonstrated antibodies, should they receive the vaccine, and then should they be a different priority than someone who has not had the virus?
And it just so happens the CDC came out with guidance on that very issue today. Said that in prioritizing amongst healthcare personnel, if you have to make a choice, if you have an individual who has been infected in the last 90 days with PCR confirmed or laboratory confirmed, they probably could wait. And so if you're going to prioritize between somebody who hasn't had this and somebody who has and has recovered, I'd go with a person who has not had the disease. That being said, if somebody has had the disease, is there any harm in giving the vaccine? It turns out that there were a number of people in both trials that were antibody positive before the start, and there were no ill effects noted in that smaller cohort. So some prioritization there, but no contraindication or precaution.
So thank you. The next question, has there been any data on children and on time frame when the vaccine will be available for children?
So the Pfizer vaccine has been tested down to age 16, and their emergency use authorization was filed for a lower age of 16. All the companies are starting to ramp up to do the studies in children, but the first wave had been in older individuals just because of the propensity toward much more severe illness, hospitalization, and death in older people. But so that'll be forthcoming. But I don't expect on seeing an indication out there before late spring or summertime for children.
Excellent, thank you. Has there been any data on using the vaccine in pregnancy?
Well, you guys are great because CDC also had a guidance sent out today. And if you want, I can try and send these two web links on down to your academy for distribution, but this is on the CDC website as well. But the current recommendations for pregnancy and breastfeeding are that these vaccines have not been explicitly studied in either group. And so we can't really say that they are safe or unsafe in these groups. Suffice to say that almost all vaccines are incredibly safe during pregnancy. We do have precautions, for example, for the live virus vaccines, but there is actually no evidence that receiving a live virus vaccine during pregnancy has any harm to it, but it continues to be a contraindication. And so given that the two current vaccines in consideration at FDA are mRNA vaccines, mRNA is not going to be excreted in breast milk, that the likelihood of any pregnancy issues are going to be small. It turns out that in the vaccine trial from Pfizer with 44,000 individuals, they had a number of individuals become pregnant. They have not seen any untoward effects during early pregnancy, but keep in mind that the individuals are not that far in pregnancy, so they have a registry they'll be watching, but they won't have any idea on the birth outcome until, you know, March or April. So those are the things that we have to deal with right now. I think going forward, it's rational and reasonable to think of pregnancy as a precaution. Thinking of breastfeeding as not even a precaution, but kind of keep in the back of your mind, you'd have the conversation with somebody about that. And in reality, I'd be more concerned with a vaccine without any data during the first trimester as compared to the second and third trimester. But again, you have to weigh this and also keep in mind that pregnancy is a significant risk factor for COVID disease.
Thank you. And so the next question we have is, are the current competing manufacturers known to produce vaccines historically or no? And have they disclosed any conflicts of interest? If so, what are they?
Okay, so Pfizer has been long in the game of vaccine manufacturing. You know, your PCV13 probably is the most notable one that we're familiar with that's used greatly. I think some of the biotech companies paired up with large manufacturers just because it's not simple to get a vaccine manufacturing and filling plant up off the ground. Moderna Vaccines does not have any previous licensed vaccines. I think they've had some candidates out there, but they have not had any licensed vaccines. So they're kind of a newcomer. But if you look, it's really interesting over the years, you watch what happens, and there's kind of the shifting of the scientists and the executives from one company to another. So there's a lot of shared knowledge across the board. And in fact, the companies tend to share information quite a bit. In terms of conflict of interest, you know, companies are beholden to their shareholders and they exist to make profit. On the flip side, if you're going to start out, becoming a vaccine manufacturer isn't the best way to make money really quick. There are a lot better, easier ways to get to that than the vaccine industry. But a couple of things also I'll mention is during the times I was on ACIP, ACIP does a very, very good job of screening people so they do not have any conflict of interest when they sit on that panel and make recommendations. I think this is also the situation for the vaccine and related biologic products group at FDA. So the people who are making these recommendations and reviewing the data are really vetted for lack of conflict of interest.
Excellent, thank you. And if patients ask, what is the most common side effect on day 2 that they should expect?
Well, the most common ones are the injection site, soreness, redness, and so on. And the things that, are more disruptive to daily living are things like fatigue, headache, low-grade fever, malaise. And whenever they're looking at side effects, they're graded, grade 1, 2, 3, and 4. And, grade 1 and 2 are pretty tolerable. Grade 3, you start thinking maybe you won't go to work that day. And it turns out that if you add grade 1, 2, and 3 together, you get up to maybe 40% of people, but most of that's going to be grade 2. So at the end of the day, I would anticipate that maybe 1 out of 20 people will have kind of the headache, feverishness, maybe chills, and fatigue to the point where they might not want to work. Most of us will be fine. But in comparison, it's very, very similar to a lot of other adult vaccines, the pneumococcal and the shingles vaccine. So nothing that really jumps off the page.
Thank you. And then the next question is are there any contraindications to the vaccine, and can you give it simultaneously with other vaccines such as flu or pneumovax?
Number one, none of these have been studied in individuals who are immunocompromised. So I think that's going to be the one contraindication. It'll come out with any known allergic response to vaccine ingredients, which is kind of the boilerplate language for any vaccine. But so I think it's the immunocompromised is going to be the contraindication. Probably precautions for pregnancy and breastfeeding. And then the second, what was the second part of the question?
Second question is, can you give it simultaneously with other vaccines?
Oh, yeah. So none of these were studied for simultaneous provision. So the long and short is give them by themselves. Don't piggyback on another vaccine until we know better. But just because of the rushed approach to trying to get the science done in a very expedited manner, that adds a layer of complexity that nobody wanted to take on in the middle of the pandemic. So get the influenza vaccine in now. If you have to, put off the pneumococcal for a bit.
Thank you. And so the next question is, what are the chances the virus will mutate, rendering the vaccines ineffective?
Well, coronaviruses in general are RNA viruses. And RNA viruses tend to have a higher rate of mutation than other viruses. So influenza, for example, is another RNA virus, and we all know that the antigen of that changes readily. So far, for now almost an entire year since we've known about this virus, the spike protein has been pretty stable. What we don't know is once you start putting in more of a vaccine selection, whether or not you start selecting for variants that might escape that. And the long and short is none of us know for sure. Fortunately, the spike protein has been relatively stable since we first discovered this virus. And we don't have any indication that there is rapid selection for a change in that. So the fingers are crossed. But I think that brings up another really good point here is other coronaviruses that are related to this one that are in common circulation in humans are seen across the lifespan. So my research group does a lot of assessment of viruses in school children, primary care, and nursing homes. And we'll find the same coronaviruses in little kids, in adults, and in elderly people, implying that these people get reinfected throughout their lifespan. And so I would be willing to bet that at the end of the day, this is a vaccine for which we will probably need a booster every 2, maybe every 3 years, somewhere in there. I'm not sure on that, but I think there's a good likelihood.
Thank you. The next question we have is, do you think there'll be a point where a doctor in private practice will be able to give the vaccine?
Yeah, absolutely. And the benefit of the first round, the Pfizer vaccine, is it works really well, but the storage is really, really difficult. Once you have a vaccine that is stable in your refrigerator for 6 months, that's going to open the door for every practice to have this. The other thing with the Pfizer vaccine is shipped in allotments of 975 doses. Don't ask me why it's 975, but that's just how it's going to come out. And because of the cold chain requirements, it's going to be really hard to subdivide that vaccine into small allotments for small clinics. So I think in the very first few rounds, we're going to see people having to go to more centralized sites for vaccination. I know my own health system here at University of Wisconsin will have 2 sites up and running, one at the hospital and then a second drive-through site. And so I think we have to be creative in how we get around this. But that being said, as new vaccines come along, we're going to find much more reasonable storage and handling requirements.
Thank you. And then one of the last questions we have is, has there been a comment if the timing between the 2 doses is crucial? Can it be longer than 21 days?
Yes, so every vaccine is, studied per protocol, and there are always going to be protocol violations, somebody who doesn't show up for their appointment in a trial and so on. And in reality, how many of us are guilty of not adhering to a schedule? I know that it was 5 years between my 2 doses of hepatitis A vaccine, okay? And the bottom line is that tends to work. I'm not advocating for any violation of the timing, but I don't think it's as critical as you might think. But that being said, we do have really good evidence that adhering to the schedule works. We have virtually no evidence to suggest that not adhering to the schedule works. So I would adhere to that as closely as possible, be it 21 or 28 days. The other thing to keep in mind is when the CDC provides vaccine to your state, and your state provides it to your vaccinators, that you will only get half of an allotment on day number 1. And then 21 days or 28 days later, you'll get the other half. And the idea is we don't want to vaccinate a lot of people with 1 dose and not have vaccine to do the second dose. If you're going to get the first one, we're really wanting everybody to get that second dose so we get up to that immune level that we hope to achieve. So to some extent, this is being forced upon us, but in a very, very nice way.
Excellent, thank you. And I've got one last question, and this is there hope the mRNA mechanism will be used to fight cancer in the future?
Well, I think there's hope for the mRNA vaccines to be used for a whole lot of things. Again, I think very early on, I mentioned that in vaccine development, we're typically or historically looking at about 15 years from, decision to, this looks like a bad disease, we'll think about a vaccine, to this situation where I don't know about you guys, but on December 3rd, 2019, which seems like a paradise right now, I had never heard of SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. And here, a year later, we have a vaccine that's likely going to be out and approved in another 7 to 10 days. And so the ability to take this messenger RNA and wrap it with a lipoprotein layer and inject it and have it work is just phenomenal. And this opens the door for a whole new generation potentially of influenza vaccines. And it opens the doors to those other therapies for cancers and so on that we're looking forward to. Anything that can be built with an mRNA or an RNA map for making a protein for which you want to generate antibodies for can be inserted in the system. And so I think it really holds a great deal of promise.
Thank you. And so we're hitting the 9 o'clock hour here. I just wanted to first and foremost thank you for an amazing hour. I think this is just so timely and just has been crucial for all of us in family medicine to be aware of the vaccine. But just wanted to ask, is there any parting wisdom that you want to share with the group as we finish up tonight?
Yeah, I think, well, two things. Number one, and I'm really being honest here, after sitting through the presentation today from Pfizer with their kind of unvarnished data, I was really pretty well blown away by both the safety and the efficacy. If it were available in the kitchen here and my wife could inject it in my arm, I'd let her do it, okay? I'd have no reservation. That's number one. But number two is we're in, a horrendous pandemic here. That last I checked, Johns Hopkins, we were at 275,000 deaths for the United States. My little state of Wisconsin is, at over 300,000 cases. And we're now recording over 100 deaths daily. And the United States hit over 3,000 deaths just today alone. And so until we have this under control, we can still control this. And the tried and true methods in public health actually do work. And that's the distancing, it's the masking, it's the hand washing, it's the testing, it's the contact tracing, it's the isolation, the quarantining. And all I can say is all this works. And you just have to look at a country like New Zealand. You can look at Australia. You can look at the People's Republic of China. And without vaccines, they brought it under control. But you have to have that will. And then on top of that, we wait for the therapeutics and we wait for the vaccines. And I think the vaccines will allow us to get back to a much more normal life again. So we're looking forward to that. But thanks so much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.
Excellent. And if you could look at some of the comments in the chat, just we're getting fantastic feedback and just a lot of gratitude from family physicians that participate tonight. So just greatly appreciate your expertise and your passion for this topic and just sharing tonight with us. It's such a crucial time, and we can't tell you how much we appreciate it. So thank you, Dr. Temte.
And all of you are really kind of on the front line, doing the hard work every day, day in and day out. And, at my point in my career, I'm only in the clinic about a half day a week. And it's hard to be in a clinic and be in PPE, have the mask and the shield on and so on. It makes everything different. So for those of you who are doing this day in and day out, you know, kudos and keep it up. We appreciate it.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. And so I just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and not to forget to continue to visit the FAFP website for FAFP.org for late-breaking information concerning the COVID-19 crisis, and to listen to any of our past webinars. Also, there's so much more that remains to be seen with the virus, surges in cases due to holidays, further impact on family physicians' practices, and of course, you know, as we've heard tonight, access to the COVID-19 vaccine. While there will be significant uncertainty ahead, one thing remains consistent: your FAFP's commitment to ensuring our members have the most up-to-date resources and information available. So please continue to read FAFP Electronic Communications and check FAFP.org for the latest updates. Finally, we appreciate the work family physicians are doing on behalf of your patients in Florida and across the country. Until we connect again in 2021, happy holidays, remain safe, have a great evening. Dr. Temte, thank you again. This was fantastic. We truly appreciate it.
And thank you, Chris, and thank you, Florida. You take care now.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a great night.